Welcome to ePG Pathshala lecture series on data analytics. In this session on data analytics, we will be discussing about clustering. The topic on clustering I have divided into 3 to 4 sessions, so that we can discuss about what is clustering, what are the requisites for clustering, and what are the various techniques related to clustering in detail. As part of this session, we will try to understand what are the challenges when we try to cluster high dimensional data, what are the real challenges when clustering is used for high dimensional data, and we will also learn about one type of clustering technique called hierarchical clustering technique. Now, consider a cloud of data points as shown in this slide. When such a data is provided to the user, and when we want to understand its structure, then it becomes very difficult for us to visualize it as well as to know key features about the structure. So, one important technique that may come to the help to know or learn in detail about the structure of a data like this is clustering. This is one important drawback related to high dimensional data, but this drawback may be overcome by means of applying clustering. Suppose if we want to cluster such a cloud of data points which is shown in the previous slide, how we may do it? Before thinking about it, let us talk about few applications or domains where such clustering may be useful. Take for example, consider a collection of text database or text documents, and you want to know what are those documents that are similar, and accordingly you want to group them, or you want to identify the documents that are related to a specific topic of interest. In such scenarios, clustering will play a major role. Another important application is DNA microarray data. From this data, we can apply clustering and then understand clearly how these patterns may be segregated or separated out. When we apply clustering on major voluminous data sets, what are the major challenges we may encounter? The first important challenge is the data set comprises of many irrelevant dimensions, and hence such irrelevant dimensions may mask the cluster. In other words, irrelevant dimensions will never result in good clusters. Another important challenge is when you want to identify the similarity or dissimilarity, how are we going to identify it using metrics? We may end up with some hundreds of metrics for identifying the distances, but when the data points are going to be separated by equal distance or equidistance data points, then the meaning in terms of the metric is very vague. Therefore, it becomes highly challenging when we are dealing with equidistance data points. And when we are talking about clusters, clusters may also exist in subspaces or subdimensions. So, exploring such subdimensions and then identifying the clusters in those subdimensions are really challenging. With these challenges, when we approach clustering for high dimensional data, what are the various methods that are available and that can be applied over voluminous data? One important technique which is very essential before you do clustering is feature transformation. Now, what do you mean by feature transformation is, the given data set may contain various features, but these features may not be directly used for grouping the data. In such scenarios, what is that you need to do is, you need to transform the existing dimensions or features to another set of new features or dimensions. Once we do this, then we may be in a position to observe the similarity or dissimilarity among the data points available in a data set. So, what are the techniques that may help you out in selecting the features and doing the feature transformations are PCA, principal component analysis. We discussed about principal component analysis in earlier sessions. And another important technique which we will be discussing later is SVD, that is singular value decomposition. This PCA and singular value decomposition are two commonly and very famously used feature selection techniques which are applied over voluminous data set. These two methods will help to identify what are the features that are correlated or what are those features that are redundant, and accordingly either the correlated data or features may be selected, else the redundant features may be eliminated out. When we apply feature selection using filtering approaches, what may happen is the features that we choose sometimes may not highlight the clusters very clearly. Therefore, you need to drill down to subspaces or sub feature space. So, identifying sub feature space and representing the data in those sub feature space is also another important challenge related to clustering. When we talk with respect to subspace clustering, that is, we need to identify or find clusters in all possible subspaces. Few techniques which are used for identifying such subspaces and clusters in all those subspaces are like click, proclus and frequent pattern matching techniques. Before starting with respect to clustering, we should know what are the real challenges with high dimensional data. Suppose if a given data has only one dimension, then the data points are going to be relatively packed. That is, we may not find any dissimilarity with respect to the data points available in a given data set. Sometimes what may happen is when you add a dimension, this will help in terms of stretching the data points, and then you may get more insight into the data and the similarity that is exhibited among the data points. So, what exactly it means is adding more and more dimensions will help in separating the data, and therefore, high dimensional data at one point of time becomes sparse. When we are dealing with respect to such a very high dimensional space and with a sparse data set, we may not be in a position to group the data, and hence it becomes a real challenge. Another important challenge is distance metrics. Sometimes the distance metrics becomes meaningless when it is going to be a equidistance data space. Let us understand what is this sparsity, how this sparsity arises because of high dimensional data. I told when we are having only one dimension, the data will be packed. Consider the figure given A, which is notated using A. Here in this figure we have 11 objects in one unit bin. So, this is the unit bin, and inside this unit bin you have 11 objects represented by means of small circles, green color circles. Suppose if I am going to add one more dimension to this dimension A, what happens is the same 11 data points now get stretched up, and here in this figure you can see the 11 data points indicated within this box, but you find the 11 data points now splitted into two sets, one set indicated using the green shade and another set indicating using the yellow shade. Now, what does it mean? The number of data inside the bin keeps reducing. Now, if one more, that is the third dimension is introduced, what may happen is the data points that are available in the unit bin now gets spread up more, and from this diagram C you can find only 4 objects indicated inside the red color box, and the rest of the points move to the other part. So, what does it mean? When you have one single dimension, the data points are clubbed together or it is packed together. When you introduce one dimension, the space between these data points increases, and when more and more dimensions are added, the same unit space will highlight only less number of data points and the data points get spreaded away. Therefore, within a unit space the amount of data points earlier was high, and by introducing more and more dimensions it becomes too less, thereby making the data, high dimensional data, highly sparse. Having understood this problem, now let us understand what are the problems of clustering. Suppose given a set of data points and you want to group these data points based on say a distance metric, and the distance metric is also given to you. Now, what is that you need to do is you need to identify those members or data points which are close to each other and those members or data points that are not close to each other. The members or data points that are close to each other are placed inside one cluster, and the members that are not close to each other are placed outside the cluster. In other words, the members within a cluster are highly similar and the members across the clusters are highly dissimilar. Now, this is how you do clustering. So, when you start processing the data for grouping, all that we need to do is we need to identify those data points that are similar, group them together, and identify those data points that are not similar and then keep them away from a given cluster point. So, usually what happens is the points that are inputted to any clustering technique will be points in high dimensional space. Now, all that you need to do is make use of certain similarity metrics for the purpose of defining the similarity or dissimilarity. Examples for such similarity metrics are Euclidean distance, cosine metric, Jaccard coefficient, edit distances, etc., etc. There are 100 such distance metrics that are available in the history of clustering, and any metric that is suitable for a given scenario may be used for the purpose of identifying similarity or dissimilarity. Now, let us take a sample scenario and then understand what are clusters and what are not within the cluster. Consider this figure. In this figure, you find 3 elliptical objects encompassing some group of data points. All the data points within these 3 elliptical objects indicate data points that are highly similar. There are also certain points you find that are not encompassed in any of these 3 elliptical objects. These data points are called as outliers. So, the 3 elliptical objects encompassing various data points that are similar are called as clusters, and the data points that are not lying in any of these clusters are called as outliers. So, the input to any clustering technique will be set of data points, the output will be set of clusters, and in certain scenarios the objective may be identifying such outliers. When you are identifying outliers, then it is called as outlier algorithms. Now, when we talk with respect to clustering, we should also understand why clustering is a hard problem. Consider the diagram given over here. This is a scatter plot, and this scatter plot highlights various groups of data indicated in various shades of color. Now, the problem here is when we talk about clustering with respect to 2 dimensions, it is very simple, but in real scenarios it is not so. The reason is, in real scenario the number of data points and the number of dimensions related to the data points are very high, and clustering with respect to very small number of data also seems to be easy. But when we want to cluster a data whose volume is so large, there are real challenges left to the researchers for the purpose of clustering. One important constraint is the place where you run the algorithm and the main memory. So, with respect to the main memory, we may not be in a position to hold the entire set of data. So, you need to read partition by partition and then cluster each and every partition and finally do an overall clustering. And in most of the cases, the clusters that you derive may not be correct in someone else's perspective. Whatever I say as the output of my clustering algorithm need not be, say, a correct output with respect to another expert view. So, what does it mean is, finally you may not be in a position to convince the audience. Many applications sometimes involve more than 50 dimensions. In actual real time scenarios, say for example like products that are sold in Amazon, you may have as many as 10,000 dimensions. So, dealing with a very high dimensional environment is going to be very difficult. Let us take this scenario. For example, if it is all going to be objects in the space, now you want to group them. You can group them into different perspectives. You can call something as a Milky Way, you can call something as, say, a set of planets, you can call something as, say, set of comets or small particles related to a comet and so on. So, if you are going to deal with, say for example 2 billion sky objects represented by means of their radiations, and assume these parameters are 7 in number, which is nothing but the frequency band. The problem here is now I need to cluster into similar objects, examples like galaxy, nearby stars, quasars, etc., etc. Now, what I group and show it to others sometimes may not be pleasing, or the dimensions that I have chosen for grouping may not be correct from another perspective. There may be another combination of dimension that may provide the exact grouping. So, when we are dealing with respect to clustering, we will have to look clustering as a holistic approach comprising of all possible combinations of dimensions for the purpose of clustering. Take a scenario, for example, grouping users or users related to usage of some music CDs. The musics may be divided into various categories, and customers who rent CDs or who purchase CDs may be associated to only few categories. Now, what are these categories really? When you want to understand this, then you will have to perform clustering of the users. So, you can take all the transactions done by the users, like what are the CDs that are rented out by the users, or what are the CDs, musical CDs that were purchased by the users, and when you try to group the users, you can find users who have similar interest coming under similar categories. So, similar CDs have similar sets of customers and vice versa. This is what you can finally infer. So, in this when we take this example, this scenario, music CD scenario, what are the real challenges? Say there may be some millions of musical CDs or DVDs available. Now, when you want to host all these CDs and DVDs, the space availability is going to be a limitation, because when you want to hold all the CDs, every CD will be having a unique ID, and assume if every ID is going to be say 2 bytes length. So, and I have 1 million means, so it is going to be 2 billion bytes consumed in my main memory, which is going to be a real great challenge. Instead, what you can do is you can hash these CDs and then make use of say some binary pattern for the purpose of representing each and every CD. Or the other way around, if you take a look at the users, every user may be associated with a unique email ID, and assume every email ID is going to have say 24 bits. That is, you are going to make use of 3 bytes. Now, in such scenario also, if you are going to have 1 million users, every user when mapped to say 24 bits, so you require 24 million bits for the purpose of representing the user. So, the space complexity increases, and naturally in many scenarios you may not have enough of space. So, dealing with such challenges is very important, and this is where say clustering algorithms need to scale up. Let us analyze another scenario, say set of documents. Assume these documents are going to be represented by means of vectors. The vectors are nothing but the keywords that appear in those documents. Now, what is that I can do is, I can simply make use of some similarity metrics for understanding whether these documents are similar or not. In case if they are similar, then they are put under the same category, else they are put under different categories. Few examples for distance metrics. I have mentioned like cosine, Jaccard and Euclidean distance. Suppose if it is going to be a cosine metric, how are we going to represent it? There every CD, take for example the music CD scenario that we discussed earlier, and there you are going to make use of a set of vectors, and these vectors are fundamentally going to be used for computing the similarity. So, all the CDs can be represented in the form of a vector. When we are going to make use of Jaccard coefficient, it is going to be, the input is going to be set of sets. So, I can identify the similarity between various CDs or various users with respect to Jaccard distance. If my input data set is going to be represented in the form of data points, say like 2-dimensional data points, then I am going to make use of Euclidean distance. So, based on how do you represent your input, the selection of similarity metric also varies. So, if it is vector, we are going to make use of cosine similarity. If it is going to be say sets, we are going to make use of Jaccard coefficient. If it is going to be 2-dimensional points in an Euclidean space, then we are going to make use of Euclidean distance metrics. The major clustering approaches, this is very important when we go for clustering, because clustering as such can be done in many ways, and there are thousands of clustering algorithms available, but in general all these algorithms can fall under any one of this 5 category. The first category is partitioning category or approach. In partitioning approach, what do we do is, we normally construct various partitions and then we group them and evaluate these groups. So, fundamentally you divide the given data into partitions and use these partitions for clustering. The second approach is hierarchical approach. In hierarchical approach, we create hierarchies and we create these hierarchies based on either similarity or dissimilarity metric. The next approach is density based approach. In density based approach, we try to take into consideration what is the number of data points within a given unit area, and we fix this as a threshold, and based on this threshold we identify or discover regions wherein data points that satisfy the threshold are available, and accordingly they will be transformed into a cluster. Grid based approach is where you have the entire data set may be represented in Euclidean space divided into various cells in a grid, and each and every region in the grid will be handled by separate clustering techniques or by a single clustering technique. There are other approaches which may comprise of lots of heuristics or cost functions, and such approaches are put together called as model based approaches, wherein various hypotheses are proposed based on the heuristics, and accordingly the data points in the input data are grouped or clustered. Now, let us start with one important technique called the hierarchical method. The hierarchical approach actually can be done in two ways. One is a top down approach, another one is a bottom up approach. When we talk about the bottom up approach, it is called as agglomerative, and the top down approach is called as divisive. For example, if you are going to have some set of data points and assume these data points are finally going to be represented using a tree like structure as shown here. Now, we can easily map to what is agglomerative approach and what is divisive approach using this tree structure. This tree structure, when you take a look from the top and when you start traversing and then reach the leaf nodes, then it is called as a top down approach. If the same happens in the reverse way, that is, you start from individual data points and then move up in the hierarchy, then it is called as bottom up approach. Now, if it is going to be a top down approach, initially we consider all the data points as one single group. So, here in the root all the data points are initially placed as a single cluster. Then we try to identify based on one or more dimensions the dissimilarity among these data points, and accordingly they may be further partitioned into two. As shown in this diagram, we are splitting the given data into two subgroups. This is based on a dissimilarity metric. Then further each and every subgroup is handled in the same way until we end up with individual data points as separate clusters. So, what is the metric which you are using as part of this method is a dissimilarity metric. If you are going to follow this in the reverse order, that is, if you are going to start with individual data points and then move up in the hierarchy, then you should identify those data points that are similar, merge them together, and then you keep doing this until you reach the root which highlights all the data points as a single group. This approach is called as bottom up approach. So, for this you require similarity metric. So, when you want to split, you require dissimilarity metric, and when you want to merge, you require similarity metric. So, agglomerative approach makes use of dissimilarity metric and divisive approach makes use of similarity metric. Now, what is so important with respect to this agglomerative technique? When we are assigning the points and when you are trying to take a look at these points, you may find few points that are similar to say either this group or the other group. In other words, they may be nearest to one or more group. This is actually a real challenge, and what people try to do is they try to make use of other metrics with which you can define how well a cluster has been formed. Now, When we try to make use of this hierarchical technique, there are three important things which we should keep in your mind. Point number one is, how do you represent a cluster that comprises of more than one point? Because when you follow either a bottom up approach or a top down approach, you are going to represent the data points in the form of a matrix. The matrix can be either a similarity matrix or a dissimilarity matrix. Now, when I merge or when I split, the resulting output will be some set of points once again. Now, how are we going to represent these set of points together in a matrix? That is a real challenge. Then the second important point to be noted here is, how do we determine the nearness of clusters? Determining the nearness of cluster is the next real big challenge. We will be addressing how it can be handled, and then finally where your clustering algorithm will stop. So, what is the stopping criteria for the clustering technique? Stopping criteria here in the sense, if it is going to be agglomerative, which is a bottom up approach, the stopping criteria for merging. If it is going to be divisive, that is a top down approach, then the stopping criteria for splitting. So, this must be decided before you start clustering. The key problem is, how do you represent the data points? In many scenarios, we represent the data points using, say, a centroid. A set of data points will be represented by means of a centroid. A centroid is nothing but average of these data points. Now, how do you determine the nearest is, we take each and every data point and then we try to identify how these data points are near with respect to the centroids. For example, here in this diagram we have 4 data points. Now, the data point 2, 1 and 1, 2, the average between these two data points is 1.5 and 1.5. Now, you try to identify how these two data points are closer to this centroid. Similarly, here in this diagram you try to identify how the two data points 4, 1 and then 5, 0 are near with respect to their average, that is 4.5 and 5.0. Now, based on this equal information, you try to build the hierarchy. The hierarchical representation finally is called as a dendrogram. Suppose you have various data points like this. You start with, say, the data points that are very close, which is represented by means of its centroid, and then during iterative process you identify the next points that are very close. Here in this scenario you start with 10, 5 and then 12, 3, then the second iteration will involve 4, 10 and 4, 8, and it keeps going. Finally, you may end up with a final visualization of your clusters, and this visualization is called as a dendrogram. When data points are available in non-Euclidean spaces, then it becomes very difficult for the purpose of representing them and grouping them. We will discuss about these non-Euclidean cases in the next session. In this session, we have discussed about what is clustering, what are the real challenges related to clustering, and how the data points that are represented in an Euclidean space may be clustered using one important technique called agglomerative hierarchical clustering technique. There we discussed about how data points are represented by means of a representative point called centroid or clusteroid. Thank you.